Right, let's talk about the UK-EU trade deal announced yesterday with a man who knows a thing or two about trade deals, but also specifically this fraught negotiation. Sir Crawford Falconer joins us, the former UK chief trade negotiator. Very good morning. Good to see you again. So, firstly, snapshot the tone that we saw yesterday and how different it was to the tone in past years between these two particular trading partners.
Oh, I mean, it's genuinely warm and almost euphoric was the impression that I got. And politically, leaving aside, and we come back to it maybe, leaving aside the technicalities of what may or may not have been agreed, a lot of which is still a bit obscure, yeah, I mean, the body language and the statements tell you perhaps more than the technicalities. I mean, this is definitely a shift in the political nature of the closeness between the EU and the UK. And I have no reason to believe it will evaporate. So that is very significant in its own right. I mean, the politics matters, and it's quite clear that there's a real shift in the way in which the UK wants to work with the EU.
Similarly, how hard is it to thread the needle, I guess, as the government have in the last few weeks, to get a US, India and EU deal over the line without having to promise something to one of those nations or trading blocs that stops you from doing the next deal?
Well, actually, I think it's quite easy, and perhaps for a reason that some wouldn't be particularly happy to hear. I mean, you know, as an old trade negotiator, I have an intellectual property right on trade negotiations. And people start describing things as trade negotiations which are nothing of the sort. And a large part of what happened yesterday, nearly all of it, in fact, was not about trade negotiations. There was a little bit that was about trade, and there was a lot to do with other things. So in many ways, the bit about trade that's really in there probably isn't in and of itself that difficult to reconcile with what else you're doing on trade.
That's very interesting. Which was the bit you're talking about trade?
Well, the narrow bit about trade is essentially what I would say is fishing, the sanitary veterinary agreement effects. They are the two bits that are really about trade. Now, it's true that what's done on carbon pricing and maybe even what's going to be done on electricity have a bit of an impact on trade, but it's very unclear just exactly what they're going to do on those things anyway. But for the rest of it, I mean, the defence and security agreement's not really a trade matter. What they have or have not agreed on students or young people is not really a trade matter either. So you could go through the whole list. I mean, the things that are dealt with on intelligence sharing and so on, and e-gates, if they have agreed anything on e-gates, which is not quite clear, they're not really trade. So people want to piggyback on the trade thing at the moment because it's got a kind of nice connotation. But it's actually not that big a deal on trade.
I want to get into some of those line items in a second, but pick up on the point you've already alluded to, the extent to which some of these things are guaranteed or just intentions.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you've got to assume that governments are negotiating in good faith. You may get a wry smile from some people when you hear that, but I presume that there's a political commitment to go down the road of what appears to be written down in this paper, which is highly general. I mean, certainly on the fishing, very clear what's being done on the fishing. What's being done on carbon markets, what's being done on e-gates, what's being done on young people or mobility agreements, what's being done on electricity, they are all work in progress, which is to be done. The sense of direction is there, but the details are not at all clear yet.
But you think when it's the UK and the EU, as opposed to maybe a more ruthless emerging market or a less trustworthy Western power that we might be thinking of, those things will materialise. You'd expect that to happen.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think they were wasting their time. Now, they may find that when they get on to discussing the electricity market, when they get on to discussing carbon trading, that they can't reach agreement on those things. The interesting question in one's mind is, on youth mobility, did they genuinely reach an impasse? Or did they just decide that actually that it was a bit too hot to be specific about that just yet, so we'll bottle it and come back to it later? So in theory, those negotiations are still to be concluded and they may or may not succeed. I mean, there's probably a will to do it. I don't think it's a con job, but, you know, you want to see the detail before you actually pass judgment on it.
So let's talk about specifically the two trade parts that you outlined. The fishing deal in return for the SPS and the food checks. Is that a reasonable trade-off?
Well, I don't know whether there was actually a trade-off of those two. There's a whole lot that's in this pot. It's a kind of bag of licorice, all sorts in many ways. But yeah, let's assume that that's the case. Look, they're probably... They made a political judgment, I think, rather than an economic judgment, would be my guess. In the case of fisheries, they kind of said, look, they could see that there was a deal done on fish during Brexit. A lot of people were very unhappy with it. But at the end of the day, it's, people aren't throwing fish heads into the back of number 10 about that deal right now. So I suppose the government felt, look, we can probably continue on with this. There'll be some people that are unhappy, but it's sort of the status quo being extended. And in return, we get something which is a small improvement in our trading relationship with the EU, which makes our food a little bit more marketable in the EU. And that's a positive. It's not going to shift the dial economically on growth, but it'll be positive, particularly for small businesses, and it'll be positive for supermarkets and so on who are wanting to import from the EU. So the EU will benefit from that. But yes, if we wanted to get access to that, the real quid pro quo is that we have to be prepared to go along with their rules, which is a political question rather than an economic one. You'll get some economic benefits from that. Are you happy to cross the Rubicon, as it were, of being a rule taker? And that's a political risk they obviously felt they were happy to take.
I guess stepping back from all of it, there's obviously trade-offs. You get some things, you give away some other things. But overall, net, was there an element before that the EU wouldn't give the past negotiating partner because they'd engineered Brexit or because they were from a different political party? Are there things that they wouldn't give to them that they have given to this negotiator?
Look, I think there may be a bit of that in it, but I don't think much, because the difference is that this government has been prepared to do things which the previous government wasn't. It could never have got a food arrangement because it was never going to accept that it would have to accept the Brussels rules on that. It would have to dynamically align. So it chose not to do that. So it wasn't even a question of whether or not they liked the previous government. It was a question of, well, the previous government wasn't in a position to do what Europe wanted. And they were not, and they hadn't certainly articulated the view that they were going to have what looks like it could be a common carbon market. That hadn't got that far. It was too early. So therefore, you didn't know whether or not that would have been something that would have worked. So I think the real reason was that there were places where the previous government didn't want to go. This government is prepared to go there, and the Euros are saying, well, OK, if you're prepared to do it the way we want you to do it, that's fine.
Final question. I asked you this for the US and the India deal. Rate it out of 10 for the UK.
Look, I mean, I will rate it against what the default position would be. And it's not meant to be critical in the abstract. I mean, in pure trading terms, if you're talking about the fisheries and the sanitary agreement, it's a relatively small trade component because the government has decided that it's not going to do single market customs union or free movement. So I can hardly complain about it in the abstract, but I'd have to say in overall economic terms, it's a 2 out of 10, but that's because they have forsworn the other 8. 10 out of 10 would be if you go into the customs union or single market, which is not going to happen. So in order to give it proportionality, on the purely trade stuff, it's not that hugely economically significant. But the other stuff is politically significant, very much so, and it could prove to be that on the carbon market trading, economically, that could be very significant. Now, it depends on what deal they cut. But to my mind, I think the really significant part of this economically is on the energy side. It's about electricity and about what you do on your carbon market trading. Now, they're claiming numbers like 9 billion. I can only assume that those numbers, if they're correct, are largely to do with carbon market trading. So in many ways, the economic significance of this may well be more on energy than on anything else. So in many ways, the real kind of deal, as it were, it seems to me, is an energy deal with the EU, which has trade implications, but is not primarily about trade.
Sir Crawford, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us.